Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first in our 2023 to 2024 series of SQE events with BPP University Law School. A big thank you especially to those of you who logged onto this event a couple of weeks ago for coming back today. As you may remember, we unfortunately faced a couple of technical difficulties that meant we had to reschedule the event, but we're really glad to see that so many of you have returned. I'm Eleanor, I'm one of the events coordinators here at Legal Cheek, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Johnny Hurst, former City Law Firm partner and BPP's head of outreach, who will be chairing this afternoon's event, as well as by Jack Sullivan. I'll let them introduce themselves properly in a moment, but just by way of a brief introduction, as many of you will know, the SQE, or Solicitors Qualifying Exam, is the new route into qualification, having replaced the LPC. It's now in its third year, having had numerous exam sits and a couple of hiccups along the way. Jack recently completed his SQE II exam, so he'll be sharing his first-hand experiences of the process and any advice that he might have for you. In today's session, then, we'll be taking a deep dive into assessments, as well as looking at the booking process, pass marks, pass rates, and more. As well as this event, we have curated a list of the most frequently asked questions from students attending these events, with answers written by BPP's SQE experts. This can be found on our SQE FAQs page, and I believe my colleague will post a link to that page into the chat in just a moment. Before I hand over to Johnny to kick off the event, I just want to do a little quick bit of housekeeping. The discussion will take place from 4 until just after 5 p.m. and will be followed by an hour of virtual networking, where you can put your questions directly to Johnny and Jack. During the panel discussion, you can send over your questions as we go along in the chat tab. This is located on the right-hand side of the screen. If we don't get to them, you will then have the opportunity to ask them again during the networking session. Make sure you've got your chat set to stage instead of event, and that way we'll be able to see your questions as they come through. At 5 o'clock, I'll pop back up on stage just to round you all up and direct you all over to the networking session. And on that note, I'll hand over to Johnny now for this afternoon's session.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, and welcome everyone to the Restore session. Again, delighted to be back with you, with Jack again, 14 days after our first attempt. Unfortunately, our other panelist, Emily, has just started job as a secondee at a law firm in her apprenticeship and is unable to be here today. But delighted to be joined by Jack. Jack, do you want to introduce yourself first, and then I'll introduce myself? Tell us where you are in your law journey. That would be probably a good thing to do.
Of course, thanks, Johnny. So I'm currently a trainee solicitor at Cooper & Co. They're a national firm dealing in the very interesting and niche world of animal law. I did my SQE I exams in January this year and I passed them, and I sat SQE II in October just gone, and I'm awaiting my results. So that's where I am now. The plan is to stay on where I currently am at Cooper & Co. Hopefully then progress from trainee to solicitor once I've passed the SQE II and accumulated those 2 years qualifying work experience.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And what we've got armed with us today on the slides we'll show you are a lot of quotes from students, some questions from many of you that were sent in advance of the session. We've anonymized them on request by the students, and Jack and I will be able to get through as many of those as we can do during the course of the next hour. And if you want to stay on for more questions, more of an informal Q&A afterwards, delighted to answer any further questions after that. So let's get cracking. Well, before I do, let me just introduce myself. I think Ellie did a little bit before, but yeah, I'm Johnny Hurst. I've been a senior lecturer at BPP for quite a few years now, teaching solicitors on the LPC and now on the SQE and the SQE. Was a partner in a city firm specialising in commercial property for some time, and yeah, been there, got the T-shirt, I suppose, as they say, and that's why I'm here today. I also run a separate independent channel called SQE TV. You might want to check that out if you're interested. So let's go and talk about what we're going to cover in this session then, folks. We're going to look at what the SQE is. We're going to look at how we prepare for the SQE. And talk about Jack's experience in particular. So all of this we'll look through the lens of Jack, but I'll give you some variations on that as we go along. We'll look at Jack's experience of how he booked for the SQE assessments and what it was like sitting them. And then we'll look at what it's like when you get the results, how they come out, and what's involved in that. And then we'll sort of wrap up at the end in about 54 minutes time or thereabouts. Great stuff. And obviously, if you've got any burning questions, do pop them in the chat. But there's quite a lot of questions we've had in advance that I want to get through on the slide. So by all means, keep your questions until the networking afterwards. But if you're going to leave before 5 o'clock, then we'll try and answer your question in the meantime. So having got that introduction out the way, let's just give you a bit of an overview, just to remind you what the SQE pathway looks like before we start exploring what the deep dive is in terms of the assessments that we're going to look at. So you've got to have a degree or equivalent to be able to start your SQE journey. It doesn't have to be a law degree. And then you have to pass SQE 1. You have to have passed SQE 1 in order to go on to take SQE 2. And at some stage in your journey, not necessarily after you've done your SQE assessments, but at some stage, you need to complete 2 years worth of qualifying work experience and pass a satisfactory character and suitability test. So basically, no previous convictions or anything that might incur the interest of the SRA, I suppose, in that front. So the first question really got for you, Jack, having sort of been through the whole of the SQE route now, waiting for your results, of course. You obviously came from an LLB background, but what would your advice be to anyone who's got a non-law degree in terms of getting them ready? Could they go straight on to an SQE course and do the SQE? What are your views on that?
I mean, obviously, theoretically, they could, and they don't need to even do a GDL, a conversion course, or a prep course. And that's one of the advantages, and that some students may not be able to because of financial restraints. But if you do have a choice and you're thinking, should I take those courses or is it just a waste of time? Then I would strongly urge you to either take a conversion course or a really strong preparation course, because the exams are tough. Obviously, I did the LLB, and then the SQE exams were a considerable step up from that. And I think I struggled getting through the exams with the LLB background, and I got a first class in my LLB, and I still found them incredibly tough. So I can't imagine sitting those exams without that previous law background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. And I'll just reiterate that and say that it's like being, if you're a non-lawyer watching this now, maybe you've done 3 years of history or physics or whatever, you couldn't just jump straight onto the 4th year of a medical degree and expect to be on a level playing field with people like Jack who've done a 3-year law degree. You've got to be able to get yourself up to their level. And frankly, over the years, the tried and tested route is to be in the PGDL or law conversion course, where generally I've taught people for over 10 years and I can't tell the difference between an LLB graduate and a law conversion graduate. But I will be able to tell on an SQE course who has done an inadequate or no law conversion course. It'll stand out like a sore thumb. So please do consider that advice very, very carefully. Just to answer Eve's question, you can stick questions into the chat there. So just to be really clear and to answer Nicole's question, almost all SQE prep courses do not do the law conversion piece. You have to do a law, an SQE plus course or a law conversion course that includes quite a lot of coverage of that core foundations of law that Jack studied over 3 years, and traditionally law converters have studied over sort of 6 to 9 months. And really, there is nothing that you can substitute for doing a really, really good course. So if you can afford it, and there are ways to do it with master's funding if you're a domestic student, to incorporate SQE1 preparation as well. That's the best way to prepare you for the SQE if you are a non-law graduate. Yasin, we'll deal with qualifying work experience later on, but let me just see if we can just go on to, because we're going to focus on the assessments themselves, because that's what we're covering in this session. In our several sessions we run with Legal Sheet, we do focus on QWE in a lot more detail, but we will touch on what counts as qualifying work experience later on, of course, as well. Okay, and there are no exemptions to SQE1, just to answer Banvi's question. We'll talk about SQE1 in detail in a moment. So preparing for the SQE, I'm literally just going to flick through a bunch of factors that you have to take into account. And I'm not going to cover them now because they would be the subject of another session. But I know this is what a lot of people are concerned about, whether it's the cost, how you fund the course, whether you have in-person teaching, online teaching, no teaching at all, and just do an app, whether the employer working for has a preference, the results of providers. These are now, some providers are now publishing their results. Interestingly, quite a lot aren't. That will be the subject of another discussion, I'm sure. What else helps you choose a course? Well, the amount of employability support you'll get to help you get a job, whether there's any qualifying work experience offered as part of it. The overall tutor wraparound support. Is it just somebody at the end of an email every so often, or is it face-to-face teaching with that immediate validation of your understanding, answering questions in face-to-face teaching, or something less optimal than that? And yeah, are you going to do a career prep course which gives you not just the SQE prep, but something more than that? Or are you just going to purely focus on SQE test prep? So all those factors you have to sort of weigh, and no factor is necessarily stronger than the other. It depends on your own personal preference, and there's quite a lot of research you need to do. We're not going to cover that today because that's really not the subject of the matter for today. But because Jack's been through the process of choosing a course, let's have a look at this question. Say, from your experience, Jack, would you recommend committing to an SQE course, or is it possible to study it for yourself? Because some people do. Some people just literally buy an app or buy a few manuals and dust down their notes from their LLB. So what's your advice to LLB students in that situation?
It's similar to the response to my last question, I suppose. These exams are difficult, and so I'd recommend putting yourself in the best position possible to pass them, and that's always going to be with a course provider. I know that course providers often, they work much closer to the SRA and Kaplan, the people setting these exams, than the majority of people who are out there publishing these books. And there is a mountain of different books that you can now buy to self-study for the SQE. And I really worry that not all the people writing them have enough knowledge to be able to help students self-study. So I think the best route is always going to be to go to the experts, so to speak, and get a proper course.
Thank you. And I think the thing that a lot of people are tempted by is we've all seen Suits, most of us, and have seen Mike in Suits, who's self-studied for the New York bar, and hey presto, I'm a New York lawyer. It's not reality. Yes, there will be one person in 100, one in 1,000 maybe, that might be able to get through that. I don't know what the stats are, but it's going to be a very low probability, and it's really not going to be the way to learn and prepare yourself in an optimal way for really challenging exams. As Jack has said, Jack's saying, he's got a first class degree, and he of course he passed SQE1, but he found them challenging. So you just need to listen to that advice really carefully before you try to cut corners and see whether you can get on, not least because the exam fees are very expensive and you don't want to be involved in paying for resits. Anyway,
Sorry, Johnny, if I could just add something to the end of that, because I think it's important. I mean, whether you're doing a prep course face-to-face or online, the most important part is how collaborative it is. And I think where the SQE is so new, it's difficult to reach out to other people who are sitting them. Often, I mean, when I was prepping for SQE1, I didn't know anyone going into my preparation from my university who was doing the same thing. And it's just that ability to sit down in a classroom and then make connections, speak to outside of the classroom, to collaborate, throw ideas around. And you wouldn't get that if you were just self-studying in isolation. I mean, there were times preparing for my workshops, for my preparation course, where I thought I understood everything. I'd then go to the workshop and it would quickly unravel that I didn't actually know as much as I thought I did. And although I was sometimes getting to the right answer, the logic that got me there was incorrect. And if I didn't have that face-to-face or just the collaborative environment, I would have gone along wrongly assuming that I knew more than I did, and I would have quickly come unstuck in the exam. So I think that's just another important point to bear in mind.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because a lot of people I can see in the chat are saying, well, I can only afford to study for the SQE by self-studying rather than buying a course. I would strongly recommend that you don't rush in to try and do it quickly by self-studying and doing it cheaply, but taking your time. For most of you guys, it's going to be a 30, 35 year career that you've got in the law. And if it takes you another year or 2 years longer than it otherwise could do to actually give yourself the optimal chance of passing by maybe working for a while and saving up for the exams, rather than trying to self-study through without having a barometer of how you're doing, like Jack described, you really just don't know where you are. And I think that's a really good point that Jack made, that students think they understand something when they read it, but when they get to class and they're challenged and tested on it, the depth of understanding sometimes isn't always there. And you won't know that if you're doing the self-studying. And I don't care how many practice multiple choice questions you do, they're only going to tell you whether you can answer that specific question rather than whether you've understood the fundamental point. But no, I think that's a really important point you made there, Jack. Thank you. So preparing for the SQE. So we've talked a little bit about that. A few questions coming up. One from the University of Exeter. Is there any prep that's worth doing before you start a course, Jack? What would you recommend? Let's
Yeah,
assume somebody has an LLB or a law conversion course at this stage.
sure. I mean, that's one thing that I really wish I did before I started my preparation course and go into the proper SQE revision, and that's brush up on the core LLB modules. So that's criminal law, tort law, contract law, all of those. I mean, I kind of put it on the back burner. I thought I'll focus on the five new areas that you really study on a preparation course, the practice modules, and I then just ran out of time. There is so much content to cover for the SQE that if you leave all the LLB stuff to the end, you are going to struggle to fit it into your revision timetable when it comes up to the exam. So if you've got a gap between finishing university or whatever you're doing and then starting a preparation course, please do what I failed to do and just brush up on that LLB knowledge and make sure it's in tip-top shape.
Yeah, and we'll show you the modules, just answering one of the questions in the chat. We'll show you the modules that Jack's referring to that you should be brushing up on from your LLB or conversion course in a few moments' time. Next question, what's the support like when studying for the SQE? From somebody from the University of London. I suppose it depends where you study. Jack, what was your experience?
Yeah, it is good. Obviously, that I had some admin problems, but I think that's to be expected wherever you study one of the courses. But the nice thing is about doing a prep course, again, rather than self-studying, is that there are teams of people in place. So whether you've got problems with funding or problems with logistical elements of classes and whatever, there's teams of people to help you. So I think on the whole, the care and the support you get on these prep courses, at least the one that I did at BPP, was very good.
Yeah, but I think you need to sort of read the small print and seeing how much tutor support you actually get in the classroom, outside the classroom, and in between classes as well. What revision support there is. It's the whole wraparound tutor support. It's not just, is there unlimited access to tutors, which doesn't mean anything. What you've got to see what that actually looks like. If that just means you can send an email to somebody and they'll get back to you, that's very different than having somebody in a classroom teaching you and being able to answer your question immediately and supporting and responding to emails within 24 hours. So you do need to, do your research on that front. And just to reiterate, we are going to look at the SQE in outline to answer Nicole's question in a few seconds' time. So just in terms of preparation, Jack, how much existing prep is there? This is somebody from, or material is there for somebody, like past exam papers, what the most useful websites to go to? So yeah, you buy a course, buy a good prep course from BPP. Do you need to go outside that course? And if so, where are the good, reliable websites, if indeed you needed to?
Sure, there are things out there. I mean, past papers is the one thing that I think lots of people want, and there's sadly very little just out on the general internet. And a prep course is probably the best place for you if you do want to practice as many MCQs as possible. Personally, I mean, all I can really do is speak from my own experience. I've rarely strayed outside of the material provided to me by my prep course provider, that was BPP. They gave me what I felt was enough to get me through the exams and then some. The one thing that I perhaps struggled with in revision is condensing down the notes. Where BPP gave me so much information, it was sometimes difficult or time consuming to distill that into easy to remember flashcards, which is how I prefer to revise. And so I did buy a couple of shorter textbooks that didn't give enough detail on their own to pass the exams, but that on top of my BPP notes, it was a balance. My BPP notes over provided, and the textbooks kind of gave a much more brief summary. And so between that, I found a good balance to use, and that's personally how I revised.
Yeah, the problem with buying some of those other shorter textbooks is that one worries how comprehensive they really are. And it's about getting a balance between what you can get hold of. And in terms of past questions, the SRA has only published 90 sample questions so far. A few providers like BPP have shared some questions on our websites, some sample questions that we've drafted, and there are other providers that have done that as well. So for a question from the University of Sussex, will the SRA and Kaplan provide more accurate mock questions? Well, the question is one that's very much needed. Will they provide more mock questions? Well, the answer is they've assured us that they will be having some coming to us sometime soon. And I was under the impression that something might come by the end of the year. So let's just see how we get on and see whether any further questions are published by the SRA and Kaplan, because only their questions are the ones that would be, 100% like the sort of question that we would expect. To a certain extent, BPP and all other providers, when we're drafting sample questions, are drafting questions on the basis of what we think you might get asked. It's no guarantee, of course, that question would come up at all. Now, lots of questions coming up in the chat, and I think what we'll just aim to do is to get through the whole assessment piece, which is what we're covering in the session today. So let's focus on that for the moment. So booking for the SQE assessments, Jack. I know it's a bit painful, and I'm sure a lot of people are listening in today have heard stories, read stories, not least on Legal Cheek, who are hosting this event today. What was your experience of booking for the SQE assessments?
Painful, I think, would be a slight understatement. It is like the Wild West trying to book in for SQE exams. It's only funny in hindsight, but a funny story that I think encapsulates it quite well was when I was trying to book my SQE I assessments. I live in the southeast in Kent. I started looking for assessment centres near where I am. There was nothing. And then I started looking in London, and I couldn't find any in London. Then I started looking further afield in England. There was still nothing. And unhelpfully, you have to search by town or city. It doesn't just come up with a list of available bookings for you to book onto. Eventually, I booked to sit my SQE I exams in Cyprus, because that was the closest centre to where I live in the southeast. Now, admittedly, I was half an hour late to when the booking opened. I didn't think it would make much difference. I was wrong. But that just shows you how competitive it is to get those SQE exam slots. Later on, they released more seats in London, so I was able to move, and I'm sure you'll all be pleased to know I didn't sit my SQE I in Cyprus, but I came darn close. And so make sure you get on as early as you possibly can when that booking window opens, and even then, be aware that it's not going to be smooth sailing.
Yeah, in the defence of the SRA and Kaplan, I think they would probably admit that perhaps they didn't quite get the allocation of the right number of seats in London in the early sits, but they have got a lot better, and a lot more places have now been released for the forthcoming exams. And when we look at SQE I going forwards, there'll be 5 dates to actually sit SQE I, whereas when you sat, Jack, there was only 1 date. So you can imagine that the number of seats will increase, not necessarily fivefold, but quite significantly so. So I think that is certainly a problem that is not expected to be one going forward. But nevertheless, there were people when they were trying to book for the SQE I window in January 2024 who had a really challenging time trying to book places. Let me just show you some of the feedback from students who tried to book on for January 24. They said it's chaotic, stressful. It was an inconsistent experience because some people said that they were waiting 3-4 hours to book to get their place. Other people only took an hour or two. Other people waited all day and then still couldn't get the place that they wanted, like Jack. It was very time consuming. It took most people several hours. First choice wasn't guaranteed in the way that Jack explained a moment ago, and harder than getting tickets for Glastonbury was one bit of feedback we had. So I think it is crazy that for a system where you've only got 3,000 or 4,000 people trying to book, it seems to be harder than getting a ticket to Taylor Swift or Glastonbury. But I think, and I'm optimistic with the number of seats that are offered, that people will end up getting a place if they book early on in the booking window in or around the centre where they need to be. Can't be guaranteed, but what we did at BPP is we gave our students the morning off on when the booking window opened, so that they could actually get a chance to get themselves in the queue and book in the city at the time and the date that they wanted. All the details, Nure, just to answer your question in terms of when the booking window opens, is all on the SRA's website. I don't carry all the dates in my head, so you do need to have a look at that. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention about was the SQE assessment fees, which are not inconsiderable here. Jack, at what stage did you become aware of the fees when in the process? Because that is quite a considerable sum of money, over £4,000. And actually, these are the old figures. They are now in the current year 4,564 in total. So these are out of date figures. So for you to now spend over £4,500, when did that come on your radar as being something you needed to budget for?
When I finished university and I was thinking about whether to do the LPC or the SQE, because for me the LPC was still an available route. I know it either isn't anymore or won't be shortly. I did a lot of research, and I think that's the key takeaway here. There is, in fairness to the SRA, a lot of information about the SQE on its website, and it's just your responsibility as a potential SQE candidate to look for it. And so I was aware of the fees before I started my SQE journey. And it is important because it is a significant amount of money. And so you do have to account for it and figure out where it's going to come from and how you're going to pay for that alongside your potential prep course fees as well. But no, do look at the SRA's website and everything they have up there regarding the SQE, because there is a lot of good info there.
Absolutely. And the one thing just to mention about overall budgeting, yes, you need to budget for the exam fees. In terms of financing a course, it's sometimes cheaper to buy a course and do it as a master's, because if you're a domestic student, you can access funding of over £12,000. Very different to somebody who might have to fund a course that's £4,000, £5,000 or £6,000 that doesn't have master's accreditation. So it sometimes can be it's counterintuitive in one way. It's more affordable to buy a more expensive course because you've got that master's funding available, and then for the most part, what you're trying to find is enough to obviously live off on a day-to-day basis, and the assessment fees, which aren't inconsiderable. But if you've got access to the funding for a master's, that takes a lot of the financial strain away in terms of course fees. I appreciate, doesn't mean to say that everyone can get themselves to the door of law school straight away, but it is certainly an option. I just want to address the question that Charlie raised. Actually, it was a very good question. If you have to book months in advance, how do you know you're going to be ready by the time the exam rolls around? Because I think if you sit in the January, the booking window opens in the previous October, which is I think when you would have gone through, Jack. So how did you feel about just applying in the dark, so to speak?
Yeah, it is difficult, and I went through some dark times a couple of months before my exam, or about a month before, where I think, blimey, my exam's only a month away, and I don't think I'm prepared. But I think if you do a good prep course, and again, I'm going to keep emphasizing that point because I think it's important, and you work hard at it and you dedicate as much time as you possibly can towards your studies, then it is possible and it is manageable. But I think it is a short turnaround between booking and then sitting the exam, and you just have to go into it knowing that you have to apply yourself fully to stand yourself in good stead to pass those exams.
Yeah, and because of those expensive fees, the first exam is SQE I, which costs £1,798 this year to take SQE I, so just under £1,800. If you're self-prepping and not going through a course provider, I would not book to do SQE I until you're absolutely sure you've nailed it all and you are acing all the questions that you're doing in your own time. I wouldn't recommend going down that route, but that's the only barometer you'll have to give you any indication that you've got a fair chance of passing. But by doing an exam at a reputable provider with good pass rates should give you the confidence to book in the booking window that the provider suggests you apply in. Okay, sitting SQE I. So people have asked us a little bit about what SQE I looks like and what it's like to sit it. in terms of the actual study leave, because you're employed, aren't you, Jack? And there are plenty of people who are paralegals or apprentices who are doing the SQE or working in a training contract alongside. How does it work in terms of getting study leave for you?
I was really lucky. The firm I'm in, although it's a national firm, it's small in terms of size and workforce, and I've got a good working relationship with my principal, and he was extremely flexible. Now, I know most people probably won't have that luxury if they're working alongside their studies. So I did a full-time course with BPP, and I was still working part-time throughout that. So that in itself was difficult to balance. And again, I could have as many days off almost as I wanted, thanks to my principal. And then my exams were at the end of January for SQE1, and I got the whole of January off, no problem to revise. And towards the end of December as well, I dropped down to only working 1 day a week at my request. So yeah, I was lucky. So I'm probably not the best person to ask in terms of the logistics of how it typically works in a law firm, but it is important. And I think if you are planning on working alongside revising, then have a really frank conversation with your employer about how much time can I get off, how flexible can you be, because it's difficult. And I've got friends that didn't pass or that really struggled without work commitments alongside it, and so you need to go in with your eyes wide open as to how flexible your employer can be.
Yeah, and just I would say that BPP doesn't recommend that students combine our full-time course with part-time work and anything other than a day a week. I think, Jack, you obviously incredibly organised and very motivated and work incredibly hard. But I think part of the reason why you found it challenging was you were taking on a hell of a lot in terms of the day-to-day work in the job alongside the course. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense as to why you found it challenging. Um, there's a quote here about study leave that I just wanted to share with you. That sort of echoes some of the points that Jack mentioned. It's from somebody else. It says some employers don't always understand how intense the SQE is. I was very lucky compared to some of my peers. I had a day or two in study leave before BPP's mock and internal exams, and for the SQE itself, my employer asked whether I wanted a block of study. That's a bit like Jack's one, I think, or to stagger it, and I chose the latter and had an extra study day per week and a few more days before SQE1. So I think, as Jack said, it's about having that frank conversation with your employer and explaining the position, because you do need their support. And we do hear a lot of situations where employers are less considerate, or sometimes you're not in a position to even share that you're doing the SQE with them. And that does put you under quite a lot of pressure. And you have to sort of work out how you're going to manage that, because that can be quite challenging. And yeah, it means possibly taking up all your actual holiday leave if your employer doesn't know. And that, yeah, it doesn't mean to say you're going to be very refreshed at the end of that calendar year if you're not taking any proper vacation. So let's get on and talk about SQE1, Jack, because I promised everyone we would talk about just the content briefly, and in particular, the first things we're going to show are these modules here that are covered in SQE1. You just want to remind people what these subjects are.
Now I've got this on my phone, so I'm going to have to lean right
yeah,
in
fine.
to read this.
Don't worry, I'll remind you. So these are land law, trusts, criminal law, contract tort, English legal system, and constitutional law. All those subjects have one thing in common, which is what?
They're the substantive law modules that you would have taken on an LLB or other qualifying law degree.
Absolutely right. So that's what Jack said. Really, you need to be brushing up in the interim period between maybe finishing your previous course or in the lead up to starting your SQE prep course. Start to brush up, dust down those notes. But then there's a whole host of additional subjects of business law and practice, dispute resolution, property law and practice, wills and administration of estates, criminal practice, solicitors' accounts and wills, which are assessed as well across the two SQE papers. And this is all new law, isn't it, that you won't have covered in your LLB?
Yeah, that's correct.
So talk us through the composition of SQE1. There are two papers. How are you assessed?
So you get a fact pattern. Well, you should start by saying they're all multiple choice questions for SQE1, and I think it's over 2 days. Each paper is about 5 hours long, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. January feels like a long time ago. And then in each paper, you've got a mixture of the substantive law modules, so the things that you would have done on an LLB, and the procedural law modules, which are more unique to the SQE and SQE courses. And the pass rate, I think, was 50-something% for SQE1. So you've got to get that amount of multiple choice questions right. And as I said, there's 2 separate papers, so you're not graded individually for each separate topic, which is a blessing and a curse. I mean, the good thing for me was that I really didn't like business law in practice, and it meant that I could afford to get a few wrong. And even if I failed business law as a separate topic, I could still pass the SQE exam. So, I mean, if you want a positive spin on it, then that's the way to look at it. So yeah, each question has a fact pattern. They vary in length. Some can be, a sentence or 2. Others can be more considerable paragraphs. And then you've got 5 options to pick from. The important thing to remember with how SQE1 is assessed is that although they're multiple choice, it's the best right answer, which is why I personally found the exams to be so tricky, because you can read the question and there can be, all of the answers can seem right. And that's because in a way, they are all correct. There's sometimes no wrong answer. It's just about identifying which of the answers is the most comprehensive, which of them best applies the law to the fact pattern that you've been given in the question. Now, I know that can sound quite complicated. So have I made sense there, Johnny?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's 360 of these multiple choice questions across these 2 papers, everyone. So it's a bit of a brute of an exam, 180 on each day, 90 in the morning, 90 in the afternoon, which gives you 1 minute, 42 seconds on average per question. How on earth did you feel at the end of each of those days, Jack?
Extremely fatigued. I think going into it, you see, 180 questions, 5 hours for each paper, and you think, blimey, that's going to be tiring. I found it far more tiring than I even expected it to be. And when you're sitting in that exam room, you start with a good pace, or you hope you start with a good pace anyway. But then as the clock keeps ticking down and it feels like you're not really getting through this mountain of questions, you do slow down. I mean, me personally, my brain, I think, actively looks for distractions when it starts to get a bit fatigued. And you just feel that clock ticking, knowing that you've only got 1 minute, 42 seconds or something like that for each question. It is difficult to get behind. One tip I've got for that, if you're someone like me and you're worried about time management, is I separated the whole exam into 4 chunks. So I divided the time I had for the total exam into 4 separate units. And then you get a whiteboard and a pen as part of the exam. And I made clear, writing down on that whiteboard before I started the paper, at what question number I needed to be at for each of my 4 time intervals. And it helped me keep on track of time, so I could tell whether I was slightly behind in terms of timing or whether I was ahead. And that was a really useful way of measuring where I was in the exam.
Question coming in. Can you take any notes in the exam?
Yes, you can. You get a whiteboard and pen.
Oh, so can you take any of your own notes in, though?
Oh, sorry. No, it's closed book. So none of your notes at all.
Absolutely. So there's not a separate clock, Vinod, for each question. What happens is, on average, it takes 1 minute, 42 seconds. But if you take a minute on one question, it gives you more time for the rest of the paper, so to speak. Lots more questions we can ask you about SQE1. Just give us a flavour of what it's like. Where do you take the exam, Jack? Because it's quite a procedure in terms of getting you into the exam hall, almost like a military operation. Do you want to describe your experience?
It was quite daunting. I did my SQE1 in the Excel Centre in London. So again, not Cyprus, thankfully. And the Excel building, for those that don't know it, is absolutely huge. They run huge conferences and exhibition shows and all sorts there. So you filter in and they colour code everyone. There was hundreds of us. Obviously, I don't know the exact figures, but there was definitely well over 100. And there was a few separate exam rooms. And in each room, I'd say there was well over 50 people, maybe even over 75 people per exam room. And so that in itself, is someone who was affected by the pandemic in terms of university exams, I wasn't used to sitting in exam in test conditions with that many people around me. I'm used to kind of doing them at home. I've got into the luxury of that through the pandemic. And so, again, that's something to bear in mind. It is difficult. There was also some problems that I had in terms of how the exams were run. They told us, the invigilators told us before starting those SQE exams, that everyone would leave the exam room at the same time. So that if you finished early, that you wouldn't be able to be let out early. But that wasn't what happened in practice. There was all sorts of people standing up and leaving at various times. It was quite distracting. So yeah, not without difficulty. So again, it is daunting. It's better to be aware of it now rather than be surprised and blindsided by it on the day of the exam, as I felt I was to some extent.
And what sort of break did you get between the morning and the afternoon papers?
So yeah, there's one paper on each day, split over 2 days, but there is I think it's only a 15 or 20-minute break. You get halfway through each individual paper. You'd have to fill in the blanks there, Johnny, or perhaps look on the SRA's website. But it's not much time at all. So you sit 2.5 hours of questions, and then you have a 15-20-minute break, and you go back in, and then you complete the second half of the paper. So, but it's not much time. And where I sat it, where there are so many students there, we were told it'd be catering facilities to get food. The queues were so long that actually I didn't have time to get to the front of the queue and order any food or drinks, because I wouldn't have had time to then get back to the exam room. So another useful tip would be to bring your own packed lunch and a drink to have in that break if you do want something to eat, because the exam is so long.
You can't take any food or drink into the assessment hall, though, can you?
Not into the assessment hall itself, but you can bring it in a bag and then access it during that short break that you're given between sittings.
So yeah, quite an ordeal in terms of the actual assessment, but obviously people get through it, and you've obviously got through it, which is great. Let's talk about sitting SQE II, and because that was all multiple choice questions covering that whole miscellany of different subjects. In terms of what it is, we're just going to sort of summarize it here, and then we can sort of talk about your experience of it. So this is 16 different stations, they call it, or mini assessments, 3 of which are written. Sorry, beg your pardon, 12 of which are written, and 4 are oral skills assessments, and they're studied over 5 days in total, or you take them over 5 days in total. You get 1 overall aggregate mark. So unfortunately, it's pass or fail. Basically, you can't bank any of the parts that you actually passed. It doesn't work like that. It's all or nothing, as opposed to SQE1, where if you pass one paper and fail the other, you can at least bank the paper you've passed. And the key difference between this and SQE1 is that 50% of the mark is on the skill, but they're still marking you on 50% of the actual knowledge, the black letter law knowledge, they call it functioning legal knowledge, that you were demonstrating in SQE1. So you still have to maintain that, and that's half of the mark for SQE2. And you're assessed at the standard of a newly qualified solicitor. So Jack, tell us, what was your experience in terms of SQE2? Because there's all these 16 different stations, and some days you have 4 set pieces, other days you have 2. How does it work, first of all, for the written assessments?
So yeah, I had 2 days of oral assessments first, and then I had 3 days of written assessments shortly after that. The written ones, they're held in Pearson VUE test centres. I think SQE1 is as well. But certainly for my written exams, it was just it was a much smaller environment. There was about only 7 other people sitting it with me. And there was also people sitting there driving theory tests in the same room that I was sitting my SQE2 written exams in. It's all computer based. Most of the questions take the form of an email sent to you by a partner of some imaginary law firm, asking you to do one of the legal exercises, be it legal writing, legal drafting, legal research. There's several of them, and yeah, you have to do the activity and send it back in an email into the partner. That's the form of them.
So you get sort of a certain amount of time to complete the task, and that's it. A bit like a an unseen paper, I suppose. And these Pearson VUE test centres are often the venue for people taking SQE1 as well. You chose to sit in Excel, but a lot of people sit SQE1 in those Pearson VUE test centres alongside people taking their driving test or their theory test, which is quite an ordeal. What about the oral assessments, Jack? Because that's different, isn't it? You have to travel, or quite a lot of people have to travel for these across the country because they're only hosted in London, Birmingham, Cardiff, or Manchester. Where did you sit yours?
I did mine in London, Euston, where there was again lots more people for those than there were for my written SQE2 exams. Again, that's quite a daunting experience because it's the whole logistics of how the day operates that you're not told a great deal about before turning up to it. And so I think it's important for students to perhaps listen to this because it was one of the things that stressed me out around exam time. But no, so I turned up for my oral assessments, queuing up the side of the building. There was quite a few people, I'd say close to 75 maybe. Then you get split into separate groups, and those groups are then taken down to base rooms, and those base rooms are where you're given the questions in advance of your either advocacy or client interviewing to have a read through and maybe make some brief notes. You then go off to a separate room where you'll be there'll be a person pretending to be either a mock client or a mock judge, depending on whether it's client interviewing or advocacy. The skills then are assessed one-to-one, and then once you finish them, you go back to your base rooms where you regroup with everyone else in your group, and you then have time for the client interviewing then to write the attendance note. So those base rooms are where you do the preparation ahead of the skills, and then any further matters like writing the attendance note that takes place after the skills. But the skills themselves are run on a one-to-one basis in a separate room entirely.
Right. So something like in rough figures, around 15 minutes to sort of, or 10, 15 minutes to prepare for the interview. You do the interview for about 20, 25 minutes or something, half an hour, something, and then you've got about roughly the same time again to write the attendance note. So it's quite full on, and you don't have much time to breathe, really, do you?
No, not at all. So yeah, I think the client interviewing's 15 minutes of prep, 25 minutes of client interviewing, then another 10 minutes of prep, 25 minutes to conduct the interview, then another 25 minutes to write the attendance note. And advocacy is 45 minutes of preparation and then 15 minutes of advocacy.
Thank you. And Maya's asked a really good question in the chat. Are there any practical placements or for oral skills and advocacy in SQE2? Basically, how do you prepare in an SQE2 prep course? We're slightly changing up the way we do ours at BPP. So, but there are some sort of key features in terms of how students should prepare for SQE2. You get all sorts of mock practice, don't you? So you are ready for both the oral skills and the written skills. How does that work?
Yeah, BPP provided me with a few things. There was lots of videos to watch and kind of the fundamentals of each discrete part of the skills. They were useful, but I think limited. I think the main reason why it's, again, important to do a course is because these are skills. And as you'd say with every skill, practice, practice, practice. It's the only way you improve upon any skill in life, and this is no exception. And so being with a course provider allows you to have proper mock tests, one-on-one, with someone pretending to be the judge of the client like they will on the exam day, and it just tests you. And that kind of environment is difficult to replicate outside of a course provider. And even if you've got friends and family at home to help out with that, it's setting the questions. That's much more difficult to do for SQE2 than it is even for SQE1. And so that's where a course provider, I think, is the only sensible option for preparing for SQE2.
Yeah, and getting a lot of feedback. Feedback is what students always ask us at BPP, and that's what we're very good at. And people really do learn incrementally on the back of the feedback. If you try and do it yourself, you're not really getting an idea of where you are in the whole scheme of things without that feedback. And very good point there from one of the contributors in the chat saying pro bono. I think it's Christian saying it's a great experience for client interviews. I completely agree. And we've got a great pro bono centre at BPP that you would be able to practice with real life clients. Not quite the same as an SQE2 mock, but just practicing with clients is always a good thing. I just want to show you something because there was a bit of a debacle over the SQE II venue. Got a quote here from a student in terms of their experience, because unfortunately you need to be prepared for things going wrong on the day. And somebody's thanked us in the chat for being so transparent. The actual courses themselves are challenging enough, but unfortunately, sometimes during the day things don't go right when with the IT at the venue. It's nothing to do with BPP or any other provider. This is all down to the SRA, Kaplan, and the venues that they book and the IT, and it only holds up as long as the IT holds up. And I'll just show you an experience from a student who sat in Chiswick SQE II very recently. They got there at 8 o'clock for a 9 o'clock start. They were allocated to a holding room of around 20 candidates. We was told the server was down. There were regular 30-minute updates with no news being the message each time. We waited for 4 hours without access to toilets, food, or our notes, and we were eventually released for lunch. And when I spoke to the student about this, they told me that literally they were sitting there. They couldn't access their mobiles, their notes, because there was a worry that they might compromise the exam that other people were sitting, and it was all very, very unsatisfactory. There was a slightly better outcome in the end. They were eventually able to sit the assessment in the afternoon and were exhausted by the end, but 30 candidates weren't able to sit at all at the venue that day, and they ended up sitting a few days later. Really, really quite a challenging experience, and it's not the only time that something like this happened. It is the exception rather than the norm, and by and large, with that many venues, that many candidates sitting, and that many sits, things will go wrong. But I just want you to be aware that sometimes things don't go to plan with the people organising the assessments. As I said, nothing to do with BPP. So yeah, I suppose if anything, Jack, it prepares you to be resilient, which you need to be as a lawyer, don't you?
That is very true. Yeah, I like that positive spin.
So SQE II, how did you cope with the volume of information? This is another University of London question. How do you cope with the volume of information you needed to learn in a fairly short period of time? What do you think were the key things you did to ensure your exam success?
Okay, I think the most important thing for SQE II is that you didn't take any shortcuts when revising SQE I, and so that you pass SQE I not just feeling, oh, I was a bit lucky with my results, feeling like you've got a really good, strong understanding of the core legal principles that the SQE assesses you on, because you do need to. The SQE II assesses you on the same knowledge. You've just got to know it a little bit better. And I say that because SQE I, it's multiple choice. The right answer is always going to be in front of you on the screen. For SQE II, you're just given the legal scenario, and you've just got to know the law well enough to be able to create your own answer from scratch. So you do have to have a stronger handle on the core principles. But if you've done a good enough job in preparing for SQE I, it shouldn't be too much of a difficult task to get the SQE knowledge up to that next step.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think the thing that a lot of LPC graduates who don't need to sit SQE I, they're about the only people who get an exemption from SQE I, who are LPC graduates. Who they want to qualify down the SQE route, they have to pass SQE II, and they won't have dusted down their contracts and tort notes for 3, 4, 5 years, as well as all the other black letter law subjects from their LLB or conversion course, and therefore that makes SQE II all the more challenging for SQE II graduates who won't have recently studied that functioning legal knowledge that Jack would have done as part of SQE I. We're going to show you some pass rates in a moment, so hold your horses on that, folks. How long did you have to wait for your SQE results? So how long for the SQE I results, Jack?
Oh, blimey, that's testing my memory. It was a long time. I remember that much. I'm not sure. I think if I gave you a date, I'd probably be half making it up.
Do you know what? It's changed since you got your results. You waited much longer than students now need to do for SQE I results anyway. SQE I takes about 5 or 6 weeks. So students sitting in January 24 will get the results around about the beginning of March, because the January exams are sat over the mid to end of March. The mid to end of January. So 6 weeks later is about the beginning of March. And it's much longer though for SQE II. That's 14 to 18 weeks. So yeah, you'll be waiting for your results, I think probably February for your October sit, something like that, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the 20th of Feb is the date that I've underlined should have had results by this date. So, and I sat them in October, so that shows you the length of time.
Yeah, in fact, it's SQE II results day today for those that sat in July, and yeah, we got some fabulous results, I know, from our students, I'm pleased to say. Right, so let's take a look at the SQE I results. What we're going to do is to quote from the January 2023 SIT, mainly because that was the first substantive SIT with over 3,000 students sitting. All SITs before that had many fewer students, and to be honest, the exam hadn't really settled down by then. The cohorts weren't regular cohorts comprising of a majority of recent university graduates. So this is the first typical SITs going forward, and we survey our students once a year, and we'll survey ours again in January. So what happened in January? The national pass rate was 51%, 54% for first time sitters, and BPP, we had a fantastic pass rate of over 20% above the national pass rate. And as far as I'm aware, it's the highest pass rate that any provider has announced in relation to any SIT in 2023 for SQE I. So we surveyed the whole of our cohort. So this isn't limited to any particular cohort. We surveyed all of our cohorts and got the results back from 85% of our candidates who sat. So that really does show us that, you know, we've got a reliable statistic there, and our students are doing really, really well, Jack included, of course, amongst those figures, I'm sure. And not only that, 65% of our students are in the top 2 quintiles. Jack, do you want to explain what a quintile is? Because you get that on your transcript, don't you? It tells you which quintile you're in. What does that mean?
I'm probably not the best person to explain this because statistics has never been my strength. But it's a barometer to see what kind of where you fall in the list of everyone that sat the exam. So whether you're one of the top performing students or whether you've still passed but maybe not done quite as good as others, it's just a way of categorising yourself, I believe, into where you sit with everyone else that's sat the exams.
So it's in the top 20%, the next 20%, and so on. Absolutely. And then we got the pass rate for our April SIT for SQE II. It was 77%, the national pass rate. Interestingly, it went up slightly to 79% for the results released today. It was 79% for all sitters, 81% I think it was for today's results from July. So, you know, you'll see the pass rate for SQE II around about 80% on average. And we've got a stonking pass rate of 97%. And again, we surveyed all of our cohort who sat in April, got the results back from half of them, 97% pass rate. Jack, why are the results so much higher in terms of pass rates for SQE II?
I think SQE I does a good job at weeding out weaker candidates or underprepared candidates. So I think by the time you get to SQE II, you know you're with a pretty knowledgeable group of people because they've all passed SQE I, which was difficult enough in itself.
Exactly. The candidates are generally going to be stronger. So we just got a couple of minutes just to go through a couple more questions. So how much time did you have to commit to both SQE I and SQE II? So what was your study like? Bearing in mind you were working alongside the course.
Yeah,
How much
it was
study
tough.
time did you devote alongside the course?
I've been asked this question a lot actually by people taking it, and I never give a straight answer. I'm not someone that set a timetable for myself, and I think that it's because it was difficult balancing work with the full-time course. And so the truth is I dedicated every spare hour I had to my studies. That meant on the train up to London for my BPP classes, I was always working. On the train home, evenings and weekends, often till early hours of the morning. It was intense. Now, it won't be that intense for everyone if you do a full-time course without the work commitments. But yeah, I just threw every spare hour I had at it. That's the truthful answer. So it's difficult for me to put a number on the amount of hours that I dedicated.
And I think people who are working, speaking to another candidate, they got to their work at 7 o'clock in the morning, and literally they were at their desk and worked for an hour before they actually switched on their work computer. And that's how they made sure that they got regular work alongside attending classes and everything else. I think it's just what works for you. And obviously, if you're a full-time student, we would expect students to be committed to about 35, 40 hours worth of study a week, including attending the live teaching classes. Well, I think we've talked about how you would balance, how you utilised your time. Obviously, you're working full time, and you've pretty much answered that question there from the student from the University of Roehampton. Got 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up. As law students have not yet secured a training contract, should we wait for a training contract to pay for our SQE training, or should we apply directly for an SQE Masters? It's the million-dollar question. Do I wait to get a training contract, or do I bite the bullet now and get the benefit of continuing my education and having that continuity of the legal education? It's not an easy question to answer, is that, Jack?
No, that is the million-dollar question. I mean, again, I can only speak from my experience. So I wasn't sponsored through the SQE exams or my SQE training, so I did self-fund it. I did that through the master's course that you were talking about earlier. So it gave me the student loan, the student finance to pay for the course. Now, there are benefits in that. I wasn't tied down to a training contract early, and because of that, I could have my eyes open to opportunities that came my way while studying for the SQE. And I quite like the flexibility that gave me. And I'm now doing a training contract, a really interesting firm that I'm really enjoying, and I find the work quite exciting. If I'd looked for a firm to sponsor me, I probably wouldn't have that luxury. And a real strength of the SQE route of qualification as opposed to the LPC is that you don't need that formal training contract after passing the exams. And so I think if you haven't already got a training contract offer that you're really happy with, then perhaps don't try too hard to push for that training contract just for funding, because you're probably doing it for the wrong reasons in that case. I think do the exams with a master's, perhaps, if you are struggling financially, and then just see what opportunities are out there. And you can potentially, if you've got qualifying work experience that doesn't need to be a formal training contract, you can be calling yourself a solicitor and find a few more doors opening for you. So I think lean into the advantage of the SQE route of qualification would be mine.
It's a lot easier to qualify now down the SQE route and back yourself to do the SQE first and then get qualifying work experience, because it's easier to accrue it in up to 4 different employers, whereas there were a very limited number of training contracts under the old LPC regime. So I think a lot of the fears of not being able to qualify doesn't actually materialize anymore in anything like the numbers that it used to. And the final question was, do you recommend doing the SQE before or after QWE? Well, it's the similar question, really, isn't it? That it's the same answer we've really been given. You know, there are pros and cons. You can get somebody paying your bills, or you can get the benefit of getting some advice from career services by doing the work first and getting your qualifying work experience afterwards. I suppose one advantage of doing a paralegal role, Jack, would be that it probably would inform and help you with particularly the oral skills and written skills when it comes to SQE. So there are some benefits in working beforehand and doing a bit of QWE beforehand, don't you think?
I was going to jump in with that, definitely. I started a paralegal role where I am now, actually, in my second year of the LLB. And I found that particularly with SQE II, the soft skills that you're assessed with, I already had pretty much where they needed to be, because I had the ability of speaking to clients and interacting with them and dealing with potentially vulnerable clients or confrontational clients, because I'd been doing it in my employment for the last couple of years. And that was something that my friends who were taking the SQE II, who hadn't got that any work experience, qualifying work experience, struggled with those elements, whereas for me, they were my biggest strengths. And so even if it's not a training contract or anything formal, any kind of legal placement where you're speaking to clients, or even not clients, engaging with people, because that's ultimately how you develop these skills. It doesn't need to be in a legal setting. But if you're interacting with people, you can hold your own and you can hold a good conversation and set people at ease, then that's all good stuff that's going to help you with the exams.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got fantastic opportunities for students to cut their teeth in interviewing clients and develop those skills by working in our pro bono centre, where there are dozens and dozens of places every year, probably in the hundreds actually, for students to help out with. So there we are. We've clocked round to the hour. Thank you so much, Jack. It's been absolutely amazing hearing your story, and lots of really great feedback in the chat. Loads more questions for us to answer in the Q&A. I'm going to welcome back Ellie now. Here she is. Sorry for slightly running over, but it was all good stuff, and there's so many good questions. I had to take a few of them coming in from the chat, and we'll be delighted to answer loads more when we do the networking. I'll hand over to you just to give a little bit of stage directions, a bit of housekeeping, and we'll see everybody in a few minutes' time for more questions.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Johnny and Jack, for that discussion. It was really, really informative. As Johnny's mentioned, the event isn't over just yet, so we still have just under an hour of networking to go. For the speakers, you'll need to click the blue return button, which is at the bottom of your screens. That'll take you to the front of Hopin, where you'll be able to access the virtual expo on the left-hand side. For those of you in the audience, you'll need to click on Expo, which is on the left-hand side of your page. Once you're in the expo, click on BPP's banner to enter the booth. We'd recommend that you share your audio and video while you're in there so that you can ask your question directly to our speakers. And then once your question has been answered, it would be great if you could just come off screen to let other students have a go asking their questions, and that'll make the session run as smoothly as possible. As mentioned at the beginning of the session, please do check out our SQE FAQ page if you have any questions about the SQE more generally, as we have dozens of questions up there with answers written by BPP's SQE experts, covering a wide range of different topics. So thank you very much to everyone for attending today's session, and we hope to see many more of you at our events very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks once again for Legal Cheek for hosting this. We're always delighted to run these events. We get so many fantastic questions from students, which the SQE is I think the gift that keeps giving in terms of events, because there's so much information that needs to be shared. But we'll enjoy sharing that information even more in the networking in a few moments' time. So see you there. Thanks a lot, Ellie. I'm about to jump in there. Have you got a few minutes with us to jump into that, Jack?
Yes, I do. So I click the return button, and then what else do I need to do?
And then